All right, thank you everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This is the third in the series Defending U.S. Democracy. This one is why we need third parties and how to build them. This is a production of the Georgia chapter of the Scholars Strategy Network, and I'm so glad to welcome everyone here today. My name is Lizzie. I'm the managing director at Scholars Strategy Network National. Most of you who are here today are, and who even are watching, are likely members or affiliated in some way. But for those who don't know, Scholar Strategy Network is a network of over 2,000 scholars, primarily but not exclusively social scientists, who believe that in addition to knowledge production, teaching, and research, we want to apply our work and use it to inform better public policy and strengthen democracy. That showing how, the colleges and universities that we are part of, showing the research that we produce, how all of this is part of a functional world, which allows our citizens to exercise their rights to a democracy and their part of it and understand what it means and take part in that life, is how we keep democracy moving forward and thriving. The Georgia chapter, one of our oldest existing chapters, is a great center of some of this excellent work and means to take it out of those classroom spaces and those university spaces and make it something that's accessible to everyone. This series, that again, this is the third of four total, I believe, that are currently planned, is part of that project. And so we're so glad that all of our listeners and watchers and participants are here with us today. You are always welcome to check, and I'm going to put the link in the chat now. If there is a chapter near you, there are chapters all over the country comprised of scholars like those that you're going to meet today, who are interested in taking their knowledge and expertise out of the classroom, applying it to some of our most pressing policy problems. And so we'd love to have you join in that effort. The Georgia chapter is co-led by Dr. Bernard Tamas of Valdosta State, Dr. Michael Evans of Georgia State University. They're excellent co-leaders, and they're going to be presenting today. And in fact, I'm going to hand it over to Mike Evans. He's going to kick us off and tell us about what our agenda looks like today.
Thanks, Lizzie. Hi, everyone. Great to see you. Thanks for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Bernie Tamas. Bernie's my partner in crime here in Georgia. He's the co-director of SSN with me, and we planned this series. We thought it'd be given our research interests and work we're doing, we thought it would be a good thing to do in conjunction with SSN National, talking about what we can do as scholars to defend American democracy. And Bernie today is going to bring his expertise on third parties, on the history of third parties, their role in American history. Periodically, we've had third parties that, even though we have a pretty stable two-party system, periodically third parties have disrupted our politics and created realignments. And Bernie, I believe, contends that we have conditions that, while they're unique today in many respects, in some ways resemble previous episodes when third parties broke through and brought about change. And I'm looking forward to hearing the specifics on that, what he has in mind. And without any further ado, Bernie, would you like to take it from there?
All right, thank you, Mike. Let me get the screen shared and then we'll get rolling. And okay, just trying to maximize this. Just give me one moment. There we are. All right. Well, thank you so much, Lizzie. Thank you so much for Mike. Thank you, everybody who put aside time in your busy schedules to come and hear our third of four. We plan to webinars. We plan to continue doing this as a ongoing series on U.S. democracy, considering the crises that we're facing in this country. And so. Today I'm going to be focusing on my aspect on it, something related to my research, which is about third parties. And I think a good starting point is to mention that we had the first presentation we had, our keynote address was from Jennifer McCoy, who was presented a talk about how difficult it is to build opposition movements in moments of authoritarian takeover. And And I think that that's something that we need to keep in mind as where her emphasis on that as we develop this, as we discuss this matter. And so mine is going to be about third parties. And I guess one of the keys on this is that third parties in America have always played a critical role in securing democracy. And at this point, they're much weaker than they used to be. And this is part of the problems that we're facing. But circumstances are such that potentially, and the key word here is potentially, this is a moment where third parties may reemerge, though obviously there was no way of knowing that for sure. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Uh, and all right, let's talk about the problem. Let's starting with this. So we've established the United States has a not only do we say it's a two-party system, but it's important to emphasize it's very much a two-party. This is not a two and a half party system or simply one with two stronger parties and a lot of weaker parties. What you effectively have is two parties that absolutely dominate the political landscape and lots of smaller parties that have practically no consequences, no influence whatsoever. And there are a number of issues. Political scientists used to debate this much more, I think. If you go back a couple decades, there were those who were strong proponents of two-party system. If you go back even farther, there were those who would have argued that it was superior to multi-party democracy. And I don't think the literature would be saying that now. And there's a whole range of criticisms of having a system like ours. One of them is, and I'll go from the least, I think, to the greatest of importance. It's poor representation has always been an issue. If you're within a smaller group, you are unlikely to have real influence as opposed to the main group that one of these two parties is focusing on in the public. It leads to gridlock and conflict, and that conflict can in fact be dangerous for a democracy when you get to the point where government is not actually capable of functioning. One of the things that has become clear over time is that it produces an inflated partisan polarization. That partisan polarization will create a situation where the conflict level there becomes lack of compromise, and there becomes very much a situation where some groups are at the point of arguing that there's nothing more important than keeping the other group out of power, and this becomes destabilizing. But the one that I want to focus on most is, and it's all related to these others, is what we could talk about as increasing chances of executive aggrandizement. Executive aggrandizement is a term that has been developed maybe a decade ago or so that has been very good at explaining the rise of certain types of authoritarian states. And it's when you have leaders who are legally elected but gain enough power to significantly weaken democratic guardrails. And it's a pretty good indicator of what we're facing today. You have a situation where you have a president who is got a very much supported, even considering our last Supreme Court cases, a court system that backs him up. You have an executive branch that is in lockstep support of him. But one of the most important issues that lead to this is when you have a single party gaining majority control over the legislature. And what happens is if you add a second factor, which is lockstep support for the leader. So when you have a situation where it is, and so becomes a point where you can't, where once a party has enough power, and if it has that inclination, it can start dismantling democratic guardrails. And that appears to be exactly the situation that we're in now. And so here we are facing, what is now widely considered a crisis. But a key to this, I think, and a key to this discussion, that this is not just about Donald Trump. What we see within the Republican Party is an authoritarian shift that has been decades in the making. And you can trace it back, any looking historically, you can trace it back a number of, for quite a while back. But one of them is a key point is the rise of Newt Gingrich in the 1990s, in which it became no compromise. We're just here to beat the other side as badly as we possibly can approach. Karl Rove, who set up a lot of the strategies, for example, that now led to a huge amount of rise of right wing control within the court system. Then you have around 2010, you have the Tea Party, which began a strategy of primarying any candidate in the Republican Party that was too considered too moderate. And by moderate, we don't generally consider what we would usually talk about with moderate. Almost anyone who wasn't lockstep ideologically had an immediate threat against their careers. So when Trump stepped in, he was building on this shift. If you look at that history this way, it doesn't look like something that will shift back once Trump disappears. And so there seems to be an emphasis of, okay, if we can just get rid of Trump, then we should be in a better situation. But in fact, what you're seeing is an underlying movement within the party. And this, to me, is where the really serious long-term threat is that even once once Trump moves out of power, which is the most likely thing to happen, you still have a party that has kind of this authoritarian bent to it, and that bent could become more serious. And one of the reasons, and this is the second point why it is a problem, is the GOP's politicians, if we're talking entirely in terms of incentives, if we're talking about if their focus is entirely on staying keeping their political jobs, for most in Congress, the threat is not losing in the general election, and that's probably true in most state legislatures as well. The threat is not that they're going to lose to a Democrat or an independent or whatever in the general election. The major threat is being primaried. And at this point, it's if you take even one step against Donald Trump, you might then become a focus of a group attempting to take you down. And so the incentive system within the Republican Party right now is probably to continue to move it towards the right and continue to move it away from what we would consider standard kind of democratic politics, which includes things like compromise and working with the other side. And so here we have, first of all, so like I said, the first point being it's a historical thing. Second of all, we see the underlying dynamics which suggest continued movement in that area. And the third is you have to assume the Republican Party is going to regain power. This is why it seems like the Democratic Party's strategy is no matter what, just don't rock the boat and let us win. And if we win, then all will be better. But regardless of which, in this system, it is only a matter of time before the Republican Party, even if it loses the next two elections, even if they lose them badly, it's only a matter of time before they get back into power. And so if they maintain this kind of a authoritarian bent, we are going to see continued, concerns in this area. So this is where we get to the issue of starting to talk about third parties. And where this is a topic that I think has not gotten nearly enough attention, largely to a large degree because they've become so much weaker over the last and basically century. So this is a chart in terms of House elections over the last since basically right after the Civil War. And this is the blue line is the percent vote for third party candidates. The red line is the independent candidates, and you can see that they were never really that important. And they have a completely different pattern than the third parties. And what happens is, if you look at the lines closely, what you can see is, first of all, they were much higher and started dropping right around 1920. And more than that, they also had these spikes to them. They had these moments where they would wave in and have kind of a crashing impact on the political system, and then there would be a rapid decline. And in fact, what happened was that they emerged, they broke some stuff, and then they would disappear quickly. And then following 1920, we see kind of a rapid decline here and a complete disappearance, virtual complete disappearance by the middle of the century, and then the third party's rising again. And if we're looking at it from an international perspective, this is based on whatever on by district level across the United States and four other countries with very similar electoral systems. And what you can see is that if you look at all this period, if you look at the lines closely, and had you gone back more, the United States was the one that had the strongest third parties, the strongest, most distribution across parties of votes. And then around 1920, it collapsed. Whereas what you're seeing now internationally is a rising fragmentation, right? And again, you could easily put New Zealand into this list as well as a country that used to have a similar electoral system as ours. And so here you have, and this, by the way, tells us a couple of things. The one is there's something weird going on in the United States. And the second is it's not just the electoral system, it's not just first past the post that's leading to this the United States being so small, but also that you have what seems to be an international kind of a pressure, a rise, a movement towards greater fragmentation that we're not quite seeing in the United States. So here you have this. Now I'm going to just add one more thing to this chart. I left one out just to keep things simple. But one of the things to know is that this movement of third parties tracks very closely to polarization rates. That especially the activity of American third parties. So what happened was in 1912, after the 1912 election, when the United States started moving towards a politics of a lot more compromise, you started having the third parties almost completely disappear. And as the third party as the polarization level between the Democrats and the Republicans began rising again, this is percent vote in terms of how many votes they received. But if you look at near the end of it, if you're talking about actual third party activity, it's nearly as high as it was around 1920, almost as high as 1910. Third parties are getting on the ballot in the United States, and they're fighting the major parties. They're losing badly, but they're attempting to do so. So it isn't, a lot of what you'll hear is a lot about how they can't get on the ballot because of ballot access laws. But in fact, what you'll see is instead that they're getting on the ballots, they're just not doing very well once they're there. So here we have this movement, and what's also important to know is historically, third parties had a particular role, which was a role to the point of basically being close to a strategy. And that is referred to as sting like a bee. It was a term coined by Richard Hofstadter that has really lasted well. And sting like a bee, and this is the American context. The American context is that there's no history, none, of third parties being successful, unless you decide to call the Republicans the third party and count them. But even then, post-Civil War, even at their heyday, even their best times, third parties would only win a small number of seats in Congress and in state legislatures. But what they did, though, that was important, is that they would cause damage to the major parties. And this is the whole sting like a bee idea, is that what they would do is they would attack the major parties with some sort of a distinct policy. One that is a policy stand that is not only distinct, but I mean, it's hard to argue that there is a left or right or in the center, but what actually it's at least something that resonates to a population, especially one that's particularly angry. And what happened then is that in their best case scenarios, even if they wouldn't win seats, they would cause one or both of the major parties to lose seats. They would cause serious damage and pain, at least the threat of it, to the major parties. And then the major parties, being organizations that focus on trying to maintain power, what would happen then is they would modify. And in many cases, that would mean moderating themselves. We had this shift in the 1912 was one of the biggest years for third parties with the emergence of the progressives. The Republicans took massive damage that year. And what happened was within 4 years, they became much more moderate. And this was one of the things that led to this long period we had that many people thought was normal, but was actually kind of the exception, but a long period of much more cooperation among the major parties. Now, the second part of this is that, then this is where the bee analogy goes even farther, is that once a bee stings, the bee dies. When the major parties co-opt the issues of the third parties, the third party loses its fuel. So these third parties, the ones that have been really successful, almost always have had only a short period that they have existed. They were only around for, the greenbacks were around for a decade. The populists were around for a decade. The progressives were around for a decade, and that's it. And then they would completely disappear. But in the process, they would have the really successful ones had had dramatic impact on American politics, and I would argue were fundamental to maintaining American democracy. This is not the first democratic threat to democracy that the United States has ever faced. The South was an authoritarian state for the longest time. And part of Jim Crow was meant to squash third party movements that were coming out in the 1890s. You had in the North the Republicans around the 1910 under Joseph Cannon were basically an authoritarian party dominated by, like I said, Joseph Cannon. And it was the third parties that kneecapped them, and what actually led to a moderation that led to a more democratic government. So this is the history of that. So why then, you can ask, if these circumstances are what we see now are similar to some in the way that were then, in other words, a population deeply angry, a highly polarized political system. Well, the big thing that has changed that has really undermined third parties is the rise of modern campaigning based on television ads, based on radio. Again, this is not didn't affect places like the UK or Canada, where you had cheaper campaigns and a lot more public financing. What you have in the US is extremely expensive campaigns and a situation that it's almost impossible for third parties to raise the money in order to actually compete directly. And so what you have, therefore, on the one hand, is this rising pressure. And on the other hand, I would argue, towards potential support for third parties. And on the other hand, what you have are factors that are really limiting what third parties can do, at least the way they run for campaigns right now. Because third parties also wind up with another group of problems. Those problems include that what they do strategically now is imitate the major parties. They're trying to follow strategies almost exactly as the major parties do without the resources. And we're not just talking money now, we're also talking the professional consultants, we're talking about all kinds of other things. And so this puts them into a weaker position. Wouldn't think so, but third parties also institutionalize. They become organizations they're run by volunteers. They can often be very idealistic. They have a tendency to be looking back to the good old days when we founded and what was our original ideas, like the libertarians in the 1970s, and are in many ways incapable of pivoting when that's what's called for strategically. And even legally, part of the problem is that they're weak organizations that are easily invaded. That libertarian parties has may have been taken to pieces by a group that has come from the outside, a MAGA pro-Trump group that has effectively potentially undermined the party. But this is also how the Reform Party collapsed a few decades ago. So there's a lot of issues that the third parties face. So here we have a point of asking the question, all right, then if third parties are so central, um, but they're also so weak, what practical steps can third parties take? And again, before I get into this, let me just say again, the strongest ones almost always emerged quickly and seemingly out of nowhere. They are very hard to predict before they actually happen. Find evidence, for example, that Ross Perot was going to come in the 1990s. You're probably not going to be able to see it. We also don't have polling data that goes back enough, so we can't really look at patterns back in the 1890s or the 1910s. Uh, but this is part of it is that when we're talking about third parties or will they emerge or not, the problem is we were not going to know they're going to emerge until they've actually emerged. And so this becomes a question of, okay, well, how would somebody go about actually doing this? And what happens is probably the most important factor is that the American third parties have to focus strategically. I would refer to it as asymmetrical strategies. You kind of have to look at it the way people fighting guerrilla wars fight major armies with much more money and much more armament. It is something where you cannot fight the major parties on their own terms. You should not be realistically attempting to, you can try to win seats, and that would be fantastic. But in the process, you have to focus on basically disruption. What you need to do is create simple frameworks, a simple approach where you go after. And right now, the issue isn't a yes, would be great to have a multi-party democracy, but right now the threat to American democracy is coming from the GOP side. And what has to happen is an attempt, and we're not talking large percentages of people. We're talking, if fantastically, would be 10% of the vote, pulling from other parties and trying to pull away from the Republican side those people who are conservative that are don't like the Democratic Party, but are also very much concerned about the Republican Party, don't like Donald Trump either. Those that are somehow in the middle, but are shaky in terms of where their support lies, that this is the group, this is where the Republican Party is exposed. The farther it moves to the right, the more it's moving away from moderate conservatives, traditional conservatives, more libertarian conservatives, and but at the same time, the Democratic Party is totally incapable of pulling them in for their own problems. That this is the group that has to be gone after. But also, on top of it, historically, third parties have always been connected to social movements. And the social movements social movements don't require huge amounts of money to run. To get on the ballot, you'd have to raise on ballots in states. It's mostly just getting signatures. You need the money for all the legal challenges that would come. But it's something that can be organized. And you have to tap into the anger, into the discontent, right? Into the No Kings movement. And you have to, so you can't be running on simply here is a new set. You can't do what the Forward Party tried to do and say, we're not left, we're not right, we're looking forward. This is going to go nowhere. What it has to be is we're angry as hell, and neither of these parties are any good, and the Republican Party is moving in the wrong direction, and they're no longer a conservative party, and they're destroying America, and this is what, and we're going to put a stop to it, and vote for us now because we know you're just as mad as we are. And this is kind of this clear cut, go with Ronald Reagan. It's this is no longer a conservative party. Ronald Reagan was against tariffs. Look at these tariffs. Look at what it's doing to the American economy. Oh yes, we believe, people coming in, should follow the rules, whatever the argument is, but what we're seeing right now with ICE is just horrible. These kind of movements, these kind of very clear angry based messaging has to be put forward as a way of galvanizing people into actually challenging. And it has to be done cheaply, right? The focus has to be large, disenchanted groups of people. Third parties historically have not been always far on the left or far on the right, right? Often they target specific groups who are really mad about stuff and trying to get them to at least temporarily shift who they're voting for. So to kind of rustle up basically scare the establishment as much as possible. It also means not simply putting out a candidate and running for president. This again will do absolutely nothing. It has to be the critical issue is actually scaring the people underneath, the people running for Congress, the people running for Senate, for state legislatures, right? And it has to be, and again, you don't have to go out and find, highly qualified, trained candidates. You need names on the ballot and you need a simple message, and your goal should be around 10% of the vote. It is not to win a bunch of seats and then try to force compromise. What it is you pull enough votes that you scare politicians. In the same way they're scared right now on the Republican side about not crossing Trump, they need to be scared that, okay, wait a minute, these people are serious and I'm about to lose, votes and my job might be over. And so this kind of is where I think if we look historically and try to connect it to what we're facing today, this I think would at least be the beginnings of a strategy that I have not seen the third parties doing at all, but would make a lot more sense. And I think at that point, I guess that would be it for my speech part of this. And so I will hand the reins back to Lizzie, and if there are any questions or comments, and I will stop sharing now.
Yes, thank you so very much, Dr. Tamas. We actually have a couple questions in the chat already. Mark, you were first past the post. If you want to expound a little bit about what you've asked there, and then we'll go to Rick Donor.
Well, my question was, what about like an anti-Epstein class movement? As we're seeing this massive disillusionment with what seems to be happening with the wealthy elite in the cross between business and power and wealth, and all of this has become like a collective thing that people who know nothing about politics know it's a bad thing. People who know a lot about it know just how bad of a thing it is. It's also very much like a visceral social thing across the political spectrum. I mean, far right people are very angry about this stuff. Far left people are very angry about this stuff. Is that not like the kind of hot button thing that a third party could build itself around? And maybe it goes away as soon as all the people in the files, are taken care of in whatever way that needs to be done in society. Through whatever legal channels, and then that would leave, because in the bee analogy, you've got the sting, you eliminated those people, and it pushed things in a different direction. So maybe something like that can happen in the future, and then the movement dies because that problem is solved. Is that the kind of thing we'd want to look for?
I think that's exactly right. I actually probably should have used that example. I think it's I mean, why is this Epstein thing such a big deal? I mean, it's not like usual scandals we see. I mean, the guy who's the head of the scandal is dead and has been dead, and it doesn't actually own. He's not in an office anywhere, in a political office. But what it does is it expresses the rising anger that's developing in the U.S. I mean, and again, we can talk about it as in terms of populism, but again, without distinguishing between right wing and left wing, it's more of a, we're being screwed by these corrupt people. And often these are the kinds of things that set it off. I mean, obviously, economic decline, if it's serious enough, will also set it off. But it has to be, yes, this kind of a something that kicks in visceral, that pretty much anyone can understand. And I think you're absolutely right. And it's a lot of it is framing. The social movement, you can learn a lot by studying social movements. The social movement literature talks a lot about how the social movements have to frame the argument. The framing of it is so critically important. And here, the framing of it is critically important. And I think that the Epstein, and why is this Epstein thing so big and not going away? Because it reflects some sort of deep-rooted anger a lot of Americans have. What they need is an option that they will actually like. And I don't think that they're being provided that right now. And so, yes, I think you're absolutely right on the money on this one.
Thanks for that. Rick, do you want to expound on your question from the chat?
Sure. Hey, Bernie. My question is, how do you sting like a bee? How does that relate to people who emphasize the need for a more locally grounded set of social and political entities, right? That one of the, and there was a recent article that talked about how MAGA can teach Democrats things, and one of the major points was MAGA is composed of a set of decentralized, locally rooted entities that coalesce at various times, and that the kind of quote progressive equivalent is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So it's not clear to me how what you're saying. I mean, I have questions about what No Kings did. I have questions about what the Women's March after in the first Trump Trump rule accomplished. It's just not clear to me. So talk a little bit about whether or not locally grounded social movements or entities have a role or are important. And if so, what would that take? What are your ideals? Do you point to Mothers Against Drunk Driving or what?
I mean, that's a great point and a great question. And I would probably start by looking and saying, well, let's remember how the Karl Rove strategy was in terms of this shift in the Republican Party, included doing exactly the things that you were talking about. Was the Democrats were entirely focused on the Congress or higher running for state legislature, and they're like, no, let's take over school boards. Let's take over, let's create this infrastructure. And this has been a massive problem with the third party movement over the last 50 years. I mean, if you look at the three big ones, we're talking the Libertarians, the Greens, and the Reform Party. The Reform Party was basically, Ross Perot and, a bunch of other people that mostly didn't do very much. Even with the Libertarians and the Greens, it's been a focus on running candidates at the top, especially, and trying to shift, and then always claiming, well, we're not here to spoil anything, we're just here to win seats. But I would argue that you have to have it, the third parties closely related to social movements, opposition movements, and so it does require this entire framework that you're talking about, from the very lowest level up to running for Congress, up to, well, you get somebody to run for president, but they're just there. They're not there to do anything other than gain some focus. So yeah, I mean, what you're saying is absolutely right. But again, remember though that these things come rapidly and decline rapidly. So and I'm not sure as much historically you had, this type of that it was exactly what you're proposing.
Let me just follow up
But
before you get
yeah, go
Jenny.
right ahead. Sure.
And it's just that the issue that I don't understand, but I would like to understand better, and that is underneath the No Kings movement, I think is kind of a fairly vibrant, at least I've been told, and I'm aware of it, participant in terms of participation to some degree, is the Indivisibles folks and the Necessary Troublers as potentially locally grounded, somewhat autonomous beings. So I'll just leave it there. That's one area of investigation I think merits.
I think that it has to be, I'm going to go back. I mean, you look at the great social movements and they had the structures that you're talking about, right? It's not just something near the top and or running for it. It has an entire, structure of people pushing, and it's an entire, it's got to be grassroots, and again, the social movements are built as networks of organizations. And look at if you look at the demonstrations in Minnesota. I mean, these people are innovating as they're going. They're learning rapidly what they're doing. You don't see the third parties learning anything. I mean, it's as far as I can tell. There's no shift. The third parties, if you go back, centuries, these were literally the people who innovated and changed the way campaigns were being run because they knew they were in tough situations, and so they shifted. And so everything you're saying is really just part of the deal. You need to have pressure at all levels, and then that pressure hopefully creates a situation where you have peeling off people who are stop just basically following where their party's going and actually challenge it in a way. And again, again, everything that you're saying, I think, is absolutely right. I'll just leave it at that.
Jennifer's had her hand up. I think we should go to her, and then Isabel, you're after Jennifer, your question in the chat.
Okay. Thanks, Bernie. You focused a lot on what third parties should do, what their strategy should be. And I think it is really interesting to think about this since we did have third parties and realignments in the 19th century, actually changes of parties, as you noted, but we haven't really had that in the 20th century and certainly not in the 21st century. And when those, the highest votes, I think, recently when you had it going up a little bit in the 1990s, 2000s, it was a little bit higher votes for third parties, but wasn't it mostly votes for independent candidates? Well, Ross Perot and, John Anderson, or actually earlier before that, and then whoever, we had somebody else, whoever else, Ralph Nader, different kind of independent candidates at the presidential level, as you're saying. So my question is, there's still something structurally that is impeding the third parties, no matter their is not just their strategy, is what I would argue. There's something structural in our system. And the other SMD countries that you listed, of course, first, they are all parliamentary. Second, Australia did change, at least for their Senate, to a form of proportional representation of using ranked choice voting and a single transferable vote for Senate. New Zealand changed to a form of proportional representation as well from SMD. And I think, so what I've been focused on is kind of the structural reform of our system. And obviously we have the Electoral College as a problem. Campaign finance is a huge problem that you noted. But I wonder what you think about two proposals that are gaining ground, I think, which is one is fusion voting that allows, though even though we don't have it in Georgia and many states do not allow it, when like New Jersey and New York had it, the Working Family Party is another third party that's maybe not winning seats, but they can use their influence to endorse candidates in exchange for concessions on particular policies. So that would be fusion voting, where two parties can endorse the same candidate. And the other is what I would like to see is multi-member districts instead of single-member districts. So some form of proportional represent that makes it much more proportionate. And it could be multi-member districts with ranked choice voting, sort of the Australia version, or pure open list proportional representation, like many of the European and Latin American systems have. And it seems to me that we're going to have that first before any third parties are really going to take off or be able to win. Because even though we have a huge demand right now, public opinion polls show people want more choice. That's clear than our two parties. They still end up doing what Isabel has in the chat, choosing the less of two evils. It's still strategic voting to keep the other one out, kind of a negative partisanship voting. So I'm wondering, what do you think is possible without that kind of structural reform, or what kind of structural reform do we need to be working on that could start at the state levels and let states experiment with their own state legislatures, and then even decide on how they want to elect their congressional representatives?
Wow. There's all very good, and there's a lot there. So if I miss something as I go through that, then you can say, okay, you've completely forgot this point that I had. Let me start by saying, yes, absolutely. I mean, I wasn't glossing over as much as I was taking it as a starting presumption that having single member districts, whether first past the post or whatever, however you define the American system, there's a little debate on that, but it doesn't really matter. This is a critical factor that drives up two parties. There'd be no faster solution to this problem than having some form of proportional representation. So that is absolutely 100% right. I guess if I jump all the way to the end, I would say if I would have my way, we would have some sort of a multi-member district system based on proportional representation, probably mixed-membered proportionality. Something close to New Zealand would be my choice. And obviously there's issues involved in that. I'm coming in this starting with the point that is the situation we're facing right now is serious enough that there needs to be some sort of opposition to what's going on kind of right now or soon or within the next 2-3 years. And, people have been arguing for PR change for a long time, and it hasn't happened. And this is, I think, absolutely, if you ask me if I could make one change to the American system, what would it be? It would be exactly what you're proposing. I would argue that based on my research, looking at the history of the structural factors influencing the third parties, that on top of having the single member districts is the way that how expensive campaigns are, how there's no public funding virtually whatsoever in the United States, that there is no steps taken whatsoever to try to make the elections cheaper and therefore more accessible, and that therefore this creates in many ways all kinds of side effects that really put third parties into a difficult situation, because there's no sense that they can possibly win. It's very hard to pull in people who actually know what they're doing. They get institutionalized with groups who often are very, very idealistic. And so that, to me, again, I mean, you brought up other issues, but I guess you did bring up the fusion. My research and I am, working families party aside, I'm pretty skeptical about moves for using fusion as a way of trying to shift things. What evidence I've seen is what happens with fusion is that the major parties use fusion mostly to co-opt the third parties and the third parties collapse. You know, the what was it? The populists were huge in 1894. In 1896, they ran with the Democratic Party. By 1898, by let's say almost 1898 already, they were dead. The progressives were, you know, they ran against the Republican Party viciously in 1912. By 1916, they were running fusion candidates, and by 1920, they were dead. And so if you're talking about it as in terms of the kind of traditional opposition third parties, it's really hard to be distinct from a major party and also running candidates with them. And that's really where the problem seems to be. You know, everyone hailed New York State as the great fusion state. New York used to be a great third party state. The third parties, you know, what happened was New York State used fusion as a way of slowly killing them. And I'll address the Working Families Party in a minute. But overall, that has been the history. Working Families Party is interesting. Working Families Party has actually made fusion work in a particular effective way, and they're almost like an interest group, you know, running as a third party. And Working Family Party certainly has had influence on the Democratic Party. They have a particular strategy, but it's not the type of thing that has pushed back to what you see with the Republicans. So my overall on this is again, nothing would be better in my mind for American democracy than a change to some sort of a proportional representation system. If I could have one, if you could give me one thing I could do in American politics today, it would be that would be it right there. Not that it's the only problem, but you had a lot. So did I answer all of them? You know, pretty good. Okay.
I know that so Isabel, some of your question was answered. And Bernie's question, you can continue if you want. Tracy, I feel like you had some statements there in the chat. If you wanted to bring those up at the end, I'll leave it to either of you.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I thought this was a very illuminating talk. I thought Jennifer's point about the difference between that your second graph that showed differences in the emergence of third parties, her point that the other systems were all parliamentary ones was one that I think needed to be brought out. Now, as I say in my second thing in the chat here, I'm actually part of a organization right now, Indivisible. In fact, I'm a member of two chapters that works very much like the social movement, like the student movement in the 1960s. And I have to say that I don't think that social movements in the United States are particularly successful when they try to ally themselves with third parties. I think their main thing is that they can shift the big parties one way or the other. Now, the other thing I was going to say is that I think that our real problems nowadays, the ones that you mentioned first, are Juan Lin's coming to roost. He said a long time ago that presidential systems are inherently dangerous because they lead to executive aggrandizement. He's right. But it's been a record for the entire century. This is not something that came along with the Republicans. In fact, you could probably get the roots of what's going on right now in the United States back to the Great Society and LBJ. That was the first time that I think it really happened. What's happening today is that we have Aaron Burr as president. Well, those were comments rather than questions, actually. One other thing. If you really wanted to change politics in the United States overnight, change the size of the House of Representatives to 500 members. Easy. Or maybe 6. Smaller districts, less opportunity for money to shift things within those districts. That's it.
All right. Well, I'm gonna, I guess, focus on your first point and then the last one, you're saying that third parties and social movements didn't really work together or it wasn't successful when they did. Well, I guess if you're talking about the civil rights movement, that is true. So if you're talking about civil rights or the women's move the more recent, the third wave, the and second wave, then you're right that they had no connections to the third parties. But if you go back historically, it's really quite the opposite. The third parties and the social movements were closely related to each other. The workers' movement in America was closely related to Eugene Debs and the socialists. The progressive movement was connected in with the Progressive Party. The populist movement, the Greenbacks. You're talking all the major ones. If you're talking long term historically, they were all closely connected, and it was a symbiotic relationship. This was a way of putting pressure on the government through multiple approaches, multiple lines of attack. And so I wouldn't say that they were more successful when they didn't. And again, whether or not intentionally or not, the third parties, when they were successful by effectively pushing the major parties. But they were pushing it by pulling down they were successful by basically threatening them, and in some cases,
Yeah.
destroying some careers. Then, in terms of, I agree with you. I like the idea I don't think there's any reason why, for a country with this population, why we need only 435 representatives in Congress. But it's not like the third parties. If we're talking about third parties, it's not like the third parties are thriving at the state legislative level and just being kept out of Congress. They're having a tough time, basically at all. A little bit easier, maybe just because of the number of seats, maybe because of the cost of running them. They're not, even in Vermont, which is about as pro third party state as you can find. You barely have anyone in the legislature who isn't a Democrat or Republican. So, I mean, and there are other reasons to argue for expanding the numbers, but at least in terms of the third party part, I'm not convinced that expanding the numbers would increase the numbers of parties in Congress. So, should we take the next question, or did you want to follow something up, Tracy?
Yeah, I think you're, let me put it this way. I think you're right and partly wrong. Uh, First, the conditions under which political movements can affect parties have changed dramatically, especially since the 1960s. And the success of of the civil rights and student movements in those days, I think, is something that we've rediscovered at different points in our history. But those movements didn't connect with third parties for a reason, I think. I think they felt that they had a target. At least the civil rights movement did. Now, I mentioned indivisible. It's like the student movement in the 60s. It doesn't have a target for a particular party. What it's doing is going after the administration itself in a direct attack. That might work, but I don't think it's going to lead to connections with a third party. And we're talking about a movement here that's the central mover behind the largest public demonstrations in U.S. history. The next one coming up on the 28th will probably be even bigger than the last one. So,
Well, I mean, if we're talking about the civil rights movement, I mean, there's a very easy explanation why they didn't connect with third parties. They were fighting against Jim Crow and large groups of people being blocked from even voting. And so strategically, it wouldn't have made any sense in that context. So
yeah.
again, the major movements that were connected to third parties were very large groups of people. So it's, why they haven't connected, others have not connected to third parties. It's a complex history, but this, again, the civil rights movement,
Yes,
you're
sir.
right, they had no connections to third parties, but why would they? I mean, there was the Democrats. It was an authoritarian state in the South, as you well know. So
Yeah.
it's that. But anyway, that would be my response on that.
Okay.
Lizzie?
Nothing more on my part.
Bernie?
Yeah.
Just, and unless somebody else has a question, I was going to, we've been kind of dancing around this issue, but you started off your talk really focusing on the Republican Party as the
Mhm.
the party that's leading to to backsliding, right? It's the real threat, right? And so I'm not sure, Isabel's point earlier was, that why would we follow any strategy that could weaken the one party that's best positioned to counteract to counteract the Republicans. I mean, we could talk about what the Democratic Party, if they get power, what they should be advocating for, like maybe multi-party, maybe the kind of reforms we're talking about, expand a really aggressive pro-democracy agenda, democratic reform agenda around, expanding the size of the House and whatnot. And I could see where independent forces might be necessary to push the Democrats to do that, because it's hard to get any major party to do any kind of electoral reform, because it's often not in their interest to do it. But I'm just not seeing how, the answer shouldn't be not only, there's two other kind of ideas that I've been hearing, that I want to. So one is a sort of divide and conquer strategy, right? Which is actually really try to break the back of it's a really unstable coalition. They've got some real cleavages in their coalition, and maybe one answer is a really aggressive. We don't want a permanent one party system, but maybe something to break the back of the Republican Party, until we can get, and then we can, and get these kind of institutional reforms in, and then, have a healthier multi-party system or whatever, or a healthier two-party system. There's that. The other is that I've told you before, there's a group of independent candidates that are coordinating, going into where they think are competitive districts where they could actually, maybe they're not a third party, but they're kind of acting like a third party. They're not cohesive enough to be a single party, but they're coordinating, and they're trying to get it, their interest is in trying to get independent voices independent from the two parties, but to push push the two parties to get sort of these kind of reforms that we need. And I'm wondering if you think maybe that could be a solution as well.
Well, I think that the issue with just the Democratic and Republican Party, and it's, I guess if you look at it, you say, yeah, well, wouldn't it just make more sense just to have the Democrats win and bash the Republicans a bit, and then the Republicans might respond. The real serious issue that we're facing is negative partisanship. So you have a lot of people who are they're okay, we're going to stick with the Republican side. They're traditional conservatives. They're ideologically on the conservative side. They're very unhappy with Trump and what they're seeing right now, but they hate the Democratic Party as well. So you have this bizarre response, what might seem bizarre if you're looking at it and saying, well, that we're seeing an authoritarian threat here, and you're complaining about the price of eggs, but really the issue could come down to, well, people are not shifting away from the Republicans, even if they don't like what they're seeing, because they hate the Democrats even more. And they see the Democrats as also as a threat. And so what you have to do in that case is provide them another option that they don't find so vile. And that is the reason why I would argue why simply saying, well, let's just let the Democrats handle this is why that doesn't seem to be
Yeah, and I
working.
mean,
How about you want to jump in, but go ahead.
yeah, I guess good. I guess what I'm saying is, if we're gonna, one thing we could put our energy into trying to get, and try to, or we should try to see a third party. I think we may see one right, some kind of push anyway. But I mean, if you look at the Democrat, the other would be to try to get the Democrat, to get the Democrats to be less unpopular, right? I mean, one of the biggest, it's kind of the intra-party debate that's going on right now, and this emergence of these majority Democrats, that are saying, it wasn't inflation alone that they probably could have won, despite the inflation, if they hadn't taken, just wildly unpopular positions on on other issues, especially immigration, right? Not right. So not, in other words, if the Democrats would be better small d Democratic politicians, right, and pay a little more attention to majority opinion on some hot issues, then it seems they would be much better positioned to, they could be a really strong, party. I mean, we could get out of this unstable majority situation we're in, but I mean, again, I'm not saying that that's realistic, but I'm not sure, the third party strategy is super realistic either,
But I would say to that these are not mutually exclusive strategies. It's kind of, Jennifer and I were talking about what we really need is multi-member systems, and the answer is yes. But you can run third parties and cause disruption and also push. In fact, the two of them work together nicely. What you're describing and a third party strategy works actually perfectly fine together, and there's no reason not to do both. If anything, the Democrats shifting should be the easier strategy to follow. But what we're also seeing is Democrats trying to make move and having no penetration whatsoever, because for a lot of people, they're not even listening if it's the Democrats bringing it up. And so this is, I mean, this is not I don't think you have to pick one or the other. I would hope the Democrats would get a little smarter in the way that they're challenging the Republican
They
Party.
got a brand. They've got to repair the brand.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
hiding the fact that Biden was, in decline, and chastising anyone who would say otherwise
Yeah.
is a catastrophic mistake. I mean, we don't know if it would have affected the results in the end. It may have still come out the same way, but there's no strategic reason why that made any sense. And so, under these circumstances, yeah, I mean, the Democrats, but again, none of these are mutually exclusive. It's not like, hey, let's have a third party or have social movements. You need people protesting in the streets, and you need, and so this is something where you need some sort of you don't even need it to be just one third party. You can have if the I mean, we didn't go into it, but the way the libertarians handled this last election is mind-boggling, mind-bogglingly bad. And under the moment where they were in the best position they possibly could in was basically self-destructive and horrible. And why would they do that? Well, it's the internal dynamics of the party and a couple of other factors. And so this is where we're at. I'm seeing still a couple more hands. Do you have one more?
Yeah.
So just to be mindful of time, we only have a few minutes left. Mark was the first hand up. Rick, you were after, but also Anne, I saw you unmute in the middle of those. So just to try to, if we could maybe get through those, I'd be happy to extend it a little bit if you are able to extend it a few minutes, Bernie.
I certainly can, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to continue what you're saying, I think a lot of this comes down to like a class conversation that we just aren't having. The Democrats and the Republicans both, for the most part, represent a certain class of people in our society.
Right.
Regardless of which flavor of ideologue they are a class of people that operate in a completely different system than the majority of the public. And I think that's where the real tension is centered in society. So, if it's a third party, has to be the thing that brings that to the forefront or whatever it is. Or it could just be one of the two major parties waking up and actually speaking to that class dynamic in some real substantial way. But I think, the two major parties have every incentive internally as institutions to want to continue to perpetuate the elites, because that's how they fund themselves and run their machines. So I think it really must step outside of the two major parties, at least until the two major parties are ready to give up the machine that makes them, the position they're in. But yeah, I just wonder, and the analogy I think of, because I like The Great Gatsby, is one of my favorite books. It doesn't matter if it's East Egg or West Egg, whether it's new money, old money, there's still a different class of people compared to the abject poverty that surrounds them at every corner. So that's just my two
Mhm.
cents, and I think that's where the real shift's going to come from, and that's why I have a lot of hope in third parties and independents, is because they have less institutional reasons to support the elites.
Yeah, I mean, since we're low on time, I won't go into too much detail, but I'll just say, I mean, that sounds right to me. You need to be able to tap into, class frustration and class anger in America, and that's absolutely key. And every major successful third party, and I'm talking about all of those between the Civil War and the around, let's say, the 1920s, even those that lasted a little bit longer, all of them did exactly what you were saying. All of them, every last one. So it's, and it's a question of how you do that in the American context where we pretend that there's no class when, issues when there actually are.
So I would build on that a little bit, but disagree with you, Mark, somewhat. My question would be, what does Mamdani show in your context? Because it seems to me that what it shows is a third party is pushing the Democrats. And good Lord, affordability in its base is a class issue, right? Affordability and precarity. So the question is how far that goes and what form it takes. And to see, hopefully, Mark, you're not right, that the Democratic Socialists, whatever socialism friggin' means in that situation, um, clearly has a role to play in even in places like Virginia and New Jersey, and those candidates were certainly not lefties, but affordability is,
Yeah.
that's the name
Yeah.
of the game
That's
now.
a winner. Yeah.
It's figuring out how to tap into the anger. I mean, then that the frustration people are feeling. I think Mark's point is right about you have to consider that there's this class side to it. But again, affordability doesn't sound like, a class-based, it doesn't sound like it's out of Karl Marx. Or any of his followers. But it's tapping in. And again, I would again say, there's not this is not a find a single strategy and go with it. I mean, what's happening with with some of the people coming in who have are pushing from different angles. This is an important part of challenging the establishment right now, even if they're doing it within the party. Did we have any more questions, or
I just wanted to
Lizzie?
jump real quick and say, I think with that economic message, you can't just message on affordability. And I think this is where Mamdani's going to prove that whether it'll work or not. Because if he doesn't actually deliver in a way that people feel like he's delivered on that desire, the desire for the state to step in and help people in dire straits, it won't fix the problem. Like whatever it is, it has to also land. It's not just a messaging issue. It's not just a positioning. It's materially, if it doesn't land, I don't think the ball's going to move forward. So that's what I'm watching with the Mamdani thing. Just wanted to throw that in.
I believe that brings us to the end of our time. That was an extremely lively and productive discussion. Thank you to everyone who's still here and the folks who had to leave and contribute to it. Bernie, I thought this was an excellent addition to the series, and I can't wait to share the video out with our listeners at home. So thank you to everyone who really contributed to that, because the dialogue is what we're here for, and we sure got it today. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Georgia SSN.